I want to get into talking to you, Brady. I want to hear a little bit of, I know some of your story, but I think that our wonderful audience here at Truth Warranted, some of them maybe don't know of you or your work or your story. So can you give us a little bit of some background on your story and maybe how you got here as an atheist?
The Brady Hardin crash course. Here we go. So I grew up a little bit south of St. Louis. My home life was a little difficult. My dad was abusive physically and verbally, and he was also a deacon at our church. My mom taught Sunday school. They ended up getting a divorce because my dad was cheating. And growing up, I felt that the religion, God, Jesus is what brought me through my parents' divorce. I remember praying about that every night, and I committed myself to the full-time ministry at the age of 14. And every decision that I made from then on was to be the best, most honest, integral, pastor that I could be. I also realized around then that I was attracted to other guys. And I'm like, this is going to be a problem as a Southern Baptist. So growing up, around 18 or 19, I hit kind of what I call a mini deconstruction, where I started to question, what do I believe and why do I believe it? At that time, my compulsion was to take the Bible even more literally. So that was my new method. And when I applied that new method, different beliefs came out of the Bible than what I was brought up with. And I was able to start telling people like, hey, I'm attracted to men, but I'm never going to act on it. And I was able to have a little bit of an outing there, a little bit of a freedom, but still was saying, this is what I'm never going to be able to do. Right. Yeah. That's not freedom. So growing up after that, I went to Bible college, did that whole thing, started youth pastoring. Churches made jobs for me, starting at the age of 16 on. And that was my goal. I ended up meeting a woman at a church that I was very attracted to. Sexuality is interesting. And we started to court, we started to date, and we got together and we got married, and then we had a kid. A little bit after that, I found out that she had met somebody else. She had a account on a dating service and was cheating. And I'm like, what the hell am I going to do now? So I ended up trying to take her back. It didn't work out. We went back and forth 3 or 4 times. In the middle of that, my best friend at that time just died of sudden heart failure. Oh my gosh. He was 28, he was my age, and he was the best man at my wedding. So there was a lot of compacted trauma right in that time. I was disfellowshipped from the church because when she finally filed for divorce, the church said that I needed to beg her to stay and ask for forgiveness of anything I ever could have done to make her want to have an affair. And to me, knowing the Bible, I was like, that's not even biblical. That's not what I would believe in, what I would do. So I was finally getting therapy for the first time. Listeners and watchers, therapy is so good. It's so important. And I was able to finally understand what spiritual abuse was for the first time. And I said to them, no. And 2 days later, I was disfellowshipped, legitimately shunned from the only family that I really knew. Around that time, I was outed to my mom. That was like, I couldn't tell my family about me. That was one thing. And my mom tried to have my son taken away because, quote, if I didn't molest, or then one of my friends would. That was the kind of homophobia that my family was in. So I lost everything, my career, everything. And I had to start rebuilding myself and finding out who I was. And I finally was able to come out, and I stopped believing in the Holy Spirit because where was he? And I thought I had this relationship with God, but all the things that the Bible said that would make him distinctive and important and undeniable were not anything that was happening in anybody's lives. We had to just make that work in our heads. And so I finally started to question all of that and started to come out and started to be open about not believing anymore, and eventually was able to start a podcast and talk about those things with other people who are going through the same. And a funny thing too, I have to throw this little tidbit in before we go to the next part, but the funny thing is that years later, my ex-wife and we continue to be friends because I wanted to provide for my son better than my family was able to do for me. My parents, they had the Holy Spirit. They were unified. They were both had Jesus in their heart. They're both Christians, even though they sinned, but they never could get along. But now it's like, I need to be able to get along with my ex-wife for the sake of my son. And we became friends again. And one day she messaged me and she's like, hey, I met someone. And I said, hey, that's awesome. I'm really happy for you. She's like, no, I don't think you understand. It's another woman. And I was like, whoa, what? And so to find out she was queer as well. And while going through therapy and leaving the religion, she was able to figure that out. And she's now married and we're co-parenting as like friends. And we even joke about if there's ever a weird like Reba situation where I have to live with them or something, we're there for it because we are each other's chosen family now. And even like we chose each other, unchose each other, chose each other again. And that's just something that my Christian parents never even could provide. And I'm very proud of that.
They probably don't even like, it's probably very hard for them to understand even how you're making this work, right? And like in your situation with your son, and like just how are you able to just move forward like this? Like your story is just like it's emotional, it's like up and down. I'm always amazed when I listen to your podcast or when I see you speak out, because you've been through so much and you have this space where you can talk about things that not a lot of other people can. The fact that you were you were aware of your sexuality early on, and you were open with a lot of people, and then that kind of also putting a spotlight on, I'm sure people were watching you very closely, making sure that you didn't, act out on those things. Like there's a whole big wild part of this that is not just about repression, but being like that watchful eye of people being so critical on everything that you did. I think that you've come a long way, obviously. And so I think that if anybody wants to hear this whole story, like you have to go check out Brady's podcast. We'll get that information a little bit later on, but it's just wild. I
was able to interview my ex-wife a couple episodes ago. And that was just, to me, it was just, I want to make this, and I want to be able to let my son hear it later on when he's older to understand like his history and his importance, and just like how him being there changed people's lives, and because they cared for him, and how that made it worth it. And also just like her and I to sit down and just have this heart to heart of, well, this is what I was going through at that time. And she was able to share what she was going through. And it was just so healing and freeing.
I'm going to cry. No crying.
No crying on this. All right. No crying on YouTube.
No, it's fine. It's a lot. It's a lot that, and like how I think it's such a good a way of showing how much forgiveness can happen outside of like what we were taught forgiveness was, or moving forward. Like that is so it's really inspiring, honestly. I think it's so good for your story to be out there for anybody, even like if they're coming out of some sort of fundamentalism, or if they're in that community still, to hear the amount of like forgiveness and amount that you have been able to move forward with that with your family, if the way that it's working now. I think it's just it's very hard to hear some of what you've been through, but it's also amazing to hear how you've gotten through it, and how you like what kind of lessons you've had come out of it as well, and the insight that you're able to offer people. But yeah, keep going. Like I want to know how you got into doing the podcast as well. When did that start for you?
So I was Facebook friends with people that I was Christians with. And so people who listen to this and watch this may know my co-host, Chuck Parson, if you listen to our show. And then another one, Jamie Lee Finch, is another one who grew up in our area. Yeah. And so we were all like Christian buddies together. Like they were in this band and I was like always there. And it felt like we interacted a lot, but I noticed that over the years, all of us were moving away from it. And Jamie at that time was being very vocal about crushing the patriarchy. And I'm like, yeah, I don't know what those words meant at first, but now that I look it up, she's on to something. Let's burn it down, And I was able to just see a few people that were coming into my life, and I got them all into a big like Facebook message, like Priska and my friend James Croft, and said, hey, I have this idea. I want to talk about this because I don't think there is much out there. Let's do it. And I don't know how I'm going to do it yet, but would you all be on? Would you let me interview you? And Chuck responded and said, yes. And I have all the equipment, and it dawned on me like, well, of course, he's a big like audiophile, and he became my co-host and started editing and was able to teach me. And so now that after all these years and throughout quarantine, he's had to move on, but I'm able to pick up that now and learn. But it's kind of just that way of getting a couple other people who were deconstructing that I could see were movers and shakers and were taking a stand on against fundamentalism in their own ways. And it just dawned on me of all these years of listening to the official Lost podcast, back in 2006, and everything was Lost inspired at the beginning, and then I was like, yeah, podcast, and it just felt normal. It felt natural.
How many years ago was that you started the podcast?
2017, 18.
Okay, yeah, so I started my deconstruction was somewhere during 2019, and so I actually did find your podcast because that was in the time where I was looking for some resources for people who were talking about this, because I didn't know there was like this whole kind of, I hate calling it a movement, but yeah, it is kind of a movement.
Yeah, it's a movement.
I didn't know there's other people out there, so
right.
Your podcast was one of the ones that I did find, and I was really happy to see that there was like content going back a couple years already. So I started listening to one of yours and a couple others that were like kind of early in the scene, I guess, in this like podcast or the conversation happening very like openly. So I really appreciate that you took that risk and that you like started that with your friends. The other people that you mentioned too, like some of those people are doing really, really important work in this conversation.
Right.
Jamie Lee Finch is she's an icon.
Yes, she's an icon. And I've heard her on like other podcasts. Like, and the life after, they really got me. And I'm like, no. Like you would have exploded with or without us. Like, but she was like our 4th episode, and she collided with that. Bam! It helped both of us in ways of getting in touch. And that means the world to me. And I love seeing when guests that I had, that they're able to do other things as well. And what not that like, I launched whatever. I just love to see that camaraderie of people working together for, yes, I hate calling it a movement, but a deconstruction.
I know it feels gross, but I mean, whatever. There's a whole bunch of us, so we might as well just kind of like, bounce each other's stories. And that's the thing too, is like, there's a lot of commonality between people's like story coming out of fundamentalism. But there's so many different perspectives as well. Like your perspective is very different from my perspective. I think your denomination, I think you said you were Southern Baptist, is that right?
Started Southern Baptist, then I became a Calvinist.
Okay.
I had a little bit of like a charismatic thing for a hot minute, but I did some experimenting in college.
Yeah. And like I grew up, I've spoken about it. Like I grew up Pentecostal, like very charismatic. I had other influence as well, Baptist and Presbyterian. And then later on, like I went through my whole process as well. But there's a couple things that like I think that there's a couple commonalities. I feel like everybody kind of did go through. Like for one thing, purity culture. I think that's something that I haven't met really anybody who didn't have these puritanical, and like we call it purity culture, but these hyper repressive, just these intense ways of looking at human sexuality and relationships. Like you said the word courting earlier, and I got a shiver down my back. Those kind of things, like it doesn't seem to matter where you are coming from in this conversation. There's some things that will kind of connect us, and I think that for better or worse makes us a bit of a movement.
And what's funny is it happens because of social media and the internet. We're able to finally get because before, if you left a church, you were disfellowshipped, you just disappeared. And but like social media and internet has given us this rage around that we're able to use and then say, okay, now listen to what I have to say. And the thing with social media is when we all got connected, it wasn't like a whole bunch of Christians all got in contact with each other and they said, here are all the miracles in my life. Here are all the super distinctive ways God's come through. No, we didn't get that. If we did have something that was that distinctive, we all would be hearing about it over and over and over, trust me. But what happened when everybody got in contact? They swapped stories of abuse. They swapped stories of indoctrination, of being influenced and conditioned to believe these ways. And we all shared stories of it not showing up the way that it promised to, the way that it won us over, won our ancestors over. And then they domino effect that indoctrination all the way down to us. But none of that stuff that makes the Bible distinctive or makes Christianity distinctive or supernatural or believable, credible or valuable, none of those things showed up, just how it's used to harm. And that should be a huge awakening.
Yeah, that's a big red flag. And I think that I totally agree with you that when we get together, the commonality also is that of abuse and that of mistreatment and, childhood indoctrination. Like these things are, that's the thing that brings us together, unfortunately.
And Miggy and me. I feel like everybody has positive, we all have positive memories of Miggy and me. And that's okay. I'm here for that.
There's no end to like the 90s and 2000 Christian memes about like all the funny things that were, that we grew up with. Like those that's a thing. That's something that if people didn't grow up in it, it's hard to understand.